On the 28th of December 2014, a young man walks out of his parents' building in Milan, believing he's about to solve a trivial problem. A delivery, a package, something that should just take 5 minutes. Pietro Barbini is 22 years old. He lives in Boston. He's only back in Italy for Christmas, staying at his parents' home before returning to his life abroad. That evening, he receives a phone call. The man on the line introduces himself as a courier. He says there's an issue with a shipment and asks Pietro to go to a certain address to sort it out. The address is close. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels dangerous. Still, Pietro doesn't go alone. His father goes with him. They reach the entrance of the building. Pietro looks at the intercom, scanning the list of names, trying to match the delivery company with something real. It doesn't match. It doesn't even actually exist. Before he can say anything, his father notices some movement. 2 people approaching, a man and a woman, both wearing hoods, both walking directly toward them with something in their hand. What does it look like? A bottle? There's no time to react. The woman steps forward. She's holding containers in her hands. And then, without hesitation, she throws a liquid straight at Pietro. At first, there's confusion. Then the pain hits. A burning sensation so violent that it feels unreal. Pietro starts screaming. He says, "Dad, Dad, it's acid." He doesn't know what's happening, only that his face, his body are on fire. His father grabs him, trying to pull him away, shouting for help, for anyone to come outside. They start running, and that's when a third figure appears. A man comes toward them at full speed, holding a hammer. They try to get away, but the situation is already spiraling. Pietro's father is shouting. People are waking up. Lights turn on. Windows open. Someone has already called the police. The response is immediate. Patrol cars arrive within minutes. The area is sealed. Confusion turns into containment. Alexander Boettcher, the man with the hammer, is stopped and arrested almost immediately, identified on the spot. And once Alexander is in custody, the rest follows quickly. Martina Levato, his partner, is arrested shortly afterward. What had been unfolding quietly for months is interrupted in real time. The violence doesn't disappear into the night. We are used to imagining violent crimes as solitary acts. Someone losing control, someone snapping, someone acting alone in a moment of rage. This case doesn't fit that narrative. What we are looking at here is violence that exists inside our relationship. Violence that is not hidden from the other person, but confirmed, reinforced, and repeated through the other person. That is what makes this story deeply unsettling. Because when violence becomes shared, it stops being an exception. It becomes a system. In the case of Alexander Boettcher and Martina Levato, harm is not something that happens despite that relationship. It happens because of it. Every decision is discussed. Every target is named. Every attack is planned. And in that process, violence stops being an act and starts becoming a language. A private language, spoken only between 2 people. A language where pain inflicted on others becomes proof of loyalty. Where obedience and desire collapse into the same gesture. Where harming someone else is no longer seen as cruelty, but as commitment. This is not the story of one person being dragged into evil against their will. It's not the story of a mastermind and a passive follower. It's the story of co-construction, a relationship where both participants actively contribute to building a moral universe that exists outside any shared reality. A closed system where only two voices matter, and everyone else exists merely as a surface to be acted upon. What makes this even harder to process is that from the outside there is nothing immediately extraordinary about this couple. No marginalization, no extreme social isolation, no background that would easily explain what comes next. They are educated, they are financially stable, they move through the city unnoticed. And that is precisely the point. This kind of violence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look monstrous in advance. It hides behind normality, behind routine, behind the intimacy of a couple that appears, at least superficially, functional. Inside that intimacy, however, something else is taking shape. A belief that the past can be erased by marking bodies in the present. That desire can be purified through punishment. That control over another person's flesh can restore order. These ideas are not sudden. They don't emerge overnight. They develop slowly, through repetition, through mutual reinforcement, through the absence of limits. And once that logic is in place, escalation becomes inevitable. Which is why the attack on Pietro Barbini is not the beginning of this story. It's the point where the structure finally collapses under its own weight. To understand how it gets there, we need to go back, not to a single moment, but to a sequence of actions that, step by step, made the unthinkable feel acceptable. Because before Pietro, there were others, and each attack pushed the boundary a little further. But before we begin with this story, let me introduce myself. Hi, I'm Martina, and welcome to the dark side of Italy. To understand what this story becomes, we need to look at the people inside it not as isolated figures, but as parts of a relationship that slowly reorganizes reality around itself. Martina Levato is 23 years old when the attacks take place. She's an only child. Her parents are both teachers. She studies at Bocconi University, one of the most prestigious private institutions in Italy. There is nothing in her background that naturally points toward violence. She grows up in a stable environment with access to education, opportunities, alternatives. This matters because it removes one of the easiest explanations. This is not a story about marginalization or social deprivation. It is not a story that can be explained away by circumstance alone. People who know Martina describe her as intelligent, reserved, compliant. Someone who adapts easily to expectations. Someone who tends to look for approval rather than conflict. When she meets Alexander Boettcher, she is at a transitional moment in her life. Still forming her adult identity, still negotiating who she wants to be and how she wants to be seen. Alexander is 30 years old. He came from Germany. He works as a broker in Milan. He is financially successful, physically imposing, obsessively focused on control. Control over his body, his image, his routines, and very quickly control over the people around him. During the events, Alexander Boettcher, surprisingly, is married to a Croatian model, but the marriage is already fractured. He lives a double life, one public and one private, and he moves through the world with certainty of someone who believes he has the right to define what things mean. What emerges clearly from the investigation is that Alexander does not relate to others as equals. He positions himself as the one who knows, the one who decides what is acceptable, what is correct, what must be punished. When he enters a relationship, that logic comes with him. At first, the relationship between Martina and Alexander appears casual, primarily sexual, but that phase does not last. Gradually, Alexander introduces a new framework, a way of interpreting Martina's past and her body. He convinces her that her previous relationships have contaminated her, that the men she had been intimate with have left traces on her body that need to be erased. This idea is not presented as violence. It is presented as necessity, as transformation, as care. If Martina wants to change her life, if she wants to become a mother, if she wants to be clean, she must submit to a process of purification. Inside this logic, punishment becomes meaningful, and the body becomes central. Before the attacks on the other people begin, Martina's own body is already being used as a site of control. She is subjected to humiliation, domination, and degradation framed as proof of love. Investigators later acquire videos in which Alexander urges her to train herself in violence, starting with animals, encouraging her to practice breaking the necks of chickens as a form of preparation. There are also materials documenting acts of extreme humiliation in which Alexander pushes Martina to degrade herself, to perform acts designed to erase any remaining sense of dignity or autonomy. One of the videos found on Alexander's phone shows Martina trying to find the courage to drink from a bottle Alexander's own piss as an act of love and submission. Not enough, he would convince her to have sex with other partners while he watched. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a system. Alongside this, there are what Martina later describes as proofs of love: markings, burns, incisions. At one point, she deliberately burns the letter A into her own skin, Alexander's initial. This gesture is not impulsive. It is deliberate. It is a declaration of belonging, a way of making the bond visible, permanent, and asymmetrical. It shows that Martina is not merely obeying instructions. She is internalizing the logic of the relationship and using her own body as evidence that the bond matters more than the pain, more than safety, more than self-preservation. From that moment, the relationship no longer revolves around persuasion. It revolves around confirmation. Every boundary crossed becomes a test passed. Every escalation becomes proof of loyalty. Gradually, the focus shifts outward. The men from Martina's past are reframed as sources of impurity, as problems that need to be corrected. Martina provides names. Alexander transforms those names into targets. Violence against others becomes the final step of a process that has already normalized harm within the relationship. This is not a situation where one person is unaware of what is happening, but it is also a relationship between equals. It is a closed system built on dominance, submission, and mutual reinforcement, where responsibility is shared even as power remains uneven. This system does not remain confined to the couple. A third figure enters: Andrea Magnani, a banker and a friend of the couple, with no previous history of violent crime. According to Kurt findings and later statements, Alexander exercises a strong influence over him as well, not through threats, but through charisma. Alexander presents himself as decisive, intelligent, dominant. Magnani, described as more insecure and compliant, struggles to say no. Within the structure created by Alexander, he becomes functional. He helps, he participates, he enables. And this is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case. What we are looking at is not a single manipulator acting in isolation, but a relational system that expands outward, where control radiates from one center, but responsibility does not disappear as it spreads. It is inside the system, this combination of domination, consent, ritual, and escalation, that the attacks take place. not as sudden explosions of violence, but as the logical continuation of a bond that has already learned to translate intimacy into harm. In 2014, violence is no longer theoretical. It has already been rehearsed privately, normalized inside the relationship, stripped of shock. What still hasn't happened yet is the step outside. The moment when harm leaves the closed space of the couple and touches someone else. That moment comes in May 2014. The first target is Antonio Margarito. Antonio is a Sicilian university student. He knows Martina because they were colleagues. They have had a relationship in the past. Nothing extraordinary, nothing that on its own would ever suggest danger. And that is exactly why he is vulnerable. Antonio believes he is meeting Martina. He does not believe he is walking into violence. The encounter does not begin with shouting or threats. It does not look like an ambush. It looks ordinary. And then, suddenly, it isn't. Martina suggests to transfer in the backseat of his car. At first, the boy seems surprised. They haven't seen each other for so long. Also, he knew that she was frequently seeing another guy. However, he trusts her. They move on the backseat, and Martina tells Antonio to close his eyes. "I want to make you a surprise," she says. Antonio is a bit confused. She says that he needs to take off his pants and his underwear. He obeys. But then, at a certain point, Martina pulls out a knife. There is no hesitation, no visible doubt. The blade is aimed deliberately. The attack is focused and directed on Antonio's genitals. Prosecutors will later describe this as a clear attempt of castration. Not symbolic violence, not intimidation, but an act meant to permanently destroy a part of his body, his identity as a man. Antonio fights back. He survives, but the injuries are severe and the trauma is immediate. He goes to a nearby hotel to find some help. Ambulance is called. He tells the emergency doctors everything about the attack. He gives a name, Martina Levato. On the other hand, Martina, after Antonio left, immediately called the Italian emergency number, claiming that she had been sexually assaulted by a man named Antonio Margarito. Later on, investigators will learn how this specific episode happened, collecting all the dots. At this moment, Antonio is still alive, still conscious, still trying to understand what just took place. What matters most for the story is not only the brutality of the attack. It is what does not happen afterward. There is no panic, no attempt to stop, no rupture inside the couple. Instead, something settles. The violence has crossed the threshold, and nothing collapses. In the days and weeks that follow, Martina and Alexander return to their routines. Martina attends university lectures. Alexander goes to work. They move through Milan without drawing attention. From the outside, their lives look unchanged. But internally, the rules have shifted. The unthinkable has become possible. By early November, violence is no longer an exception. It is a tool. On November 2nd, 2014, that tool is used again. The victim this time is Stefano Savi, 25 years old. Stefano is not meeting anyone. He is not responding to a message. He is simply returning to his home in the San Siro area of Milan after a night out. It is an ordinary moment in an ordinary day. He never sees the attackers approach. The only thing he understands is that a liquid is thrown directly at his face. There are no words, no warning, just the impact. It is acid. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. Stefano starts screaming. He runs at the door calling for his family. His skin is burning. His vision collapses. In a matter of seconds, his face is irreversibly damaged. Neighbors hear the screams, people look out of windows, an ambulance is called. Stefano survives, but his life is permanently altered. Later, investigators will establish something crucial that still nowadays shocks me. Stefano was not the intended target. He was mistaken for someone else. This detail changes the meaning of the attack. Up until now, violence has been directed at specific men connected to Martina's past. Here, precision fails. The wrong body is hit. And yet, the violence continues anyway. This tells us something important. By this point, the act itself matters more than the person. The ritual has begun to override the individual. The attack on Stefano is treated as an isolated incident. There is no immediate connection to anything else. Police officers frequently visit Stefano at the hospital and ask him, "Have you done something wrong to someone? Who can be against you? Who would want to do this at you?" Stefano will later say that he never thought for a second that the attack was intended. He lived a normal life, no problems, no enemies. However, after this event, Milan moves on. But inside the relationship, escalation continues. Less than 2 weeks later, on November the 15th, 2014, the next scene unfolds. This time, the target is Giulio Carparelli, a photographer who had also been involved with Martina in the past. He was the intended target. Him, not Stefano Savi. Giuliano is approached as he leaves his home. There is waiting, observation, timing. When the attack begins, it follows the same logic as before. Acid. Just acid. But Giuliano reacts instinctively. He says that everything happened in a fraction of seconds. He was leaving the front door of his house when, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a hooded girl holding a suspicious container. It was raining. He instinctively raises his umbrella the moment the unknown girl throws the liquid. The liquid splashes, but not in the intended way. The girl tries to run away, but Giuliano started following her. The scene becomes chaotic. Giuliano is trying to chase the girl while recording a video, until a man appears and throws pepper spray against him. The man was obviously Alexander Boettcher. He is disoriented, terrified, his eyes burning. The attack fails and the attackers leave. Despite the excruciating pain in his eyes, Giuliano manages to read the first few digits of the license plate of the car the two men fled in. This detail will be crucial for investigators as they reconstruct the events. This failure does not function as a warning or a deterrent for the couple. It functions as information. What didn't work? What needs to be improved? What should be done differently next time? Later, investigations will reveal that after this episode, there are conversations, plans, additional surveillance. The logic does not stop. It refines itself. And then, December the 28th, 2014 comes. That evening, Pietro Barbini, 22 years old, resident in Boston, but his family lived in Milan, is attacked. He receives a phone call, there is a problem with a delivery. It sounds banal, administrative, harmless. However, with this excuse, the three accomplices manage to trap Pietro and, in a matter of seconds, ruin his life forever. As I already said in the intro of the episode, Alexander Boettcher is identified and arrested on the spot. Shortly afterward, Martina Levato is arrested as well. For the first time since May, the sequence stops. Pietro is taken to the hospital with severe chemical burns to his face, abdomen, and legs. Doctors speak of a 60-day prognosis, but the reality is far more complex. Acid does not heal like other wounds. It leaves marks that reshape identity. As investigators search phones, apartments, computers, a broader structure finally emerges. Videos, messages, materials, evidence of planning and repetition. The attacks are no longer seen as separate events. They are recognized as chapters of the same story. What appears from the outside as sudden and incomprehensible violence is, in fact, the final act of a progression that had been unfolding for months. Patiently, methodically, and without interruption. On January the 8th, 2015, the first trial begins. Martina Levato and Alexander Boettcher are charged for the attack on Pietro Barbini. Martina declares herself guilty. The first sentence results in 14 years of imprisonment. While the legal process continues, life produces a disturbing contrast. In August 2015, Martina gives birth to a son, Achille, while already in detention. The child is immediately separated from her and placed under protective care. In September 2015, Martina faces further charges related to the attack on Antonio Margarito. With a fast-track trial, she is sentenced to 16 years for criminal association and grievous bodily harm. Alexander Boettcher, who chooses a full trial, is sentenced in March 2016 to 23 years in prison for criminal association, grievous bodily harm in the case of Stefano Savi, and participation in the attempted castration of Antonio Margarito. By the end of the judicial process, what emerges is not simply a list of crimes, but a trajectory. Each episode builds on the previous one. Each act confirms the same internal logic. By the time Pietro Barbini is attacked, the system is already complete. What appears from the outside as sudden and incomprehensible violence is in fact the final stage of a progression that had been unfolding for months, quietly, methodically, and without interruption. As the investigations conclude and the trials move forward, the judicial system is forced to confront a question that goes beyond the individual acts themselves. How to define responsibility inside a relationship where violence is shared? The cards are clear on one point. Both Alexander Boettcher and Martina Levato are considered fully capable of understanding and intending their actions at the time of their crimes. This assessment is central. It rejects the idea that what had happened can be explained as a momentary loss of control, a psychological blackout, or an uncontrollable impulse. The violence is recognized as deliberate, repeated, and structured. Andrea Magnani, the third accomplice, is also convicted for his role in supporting and enabling the crimes. But the legal story does not end with the sentences. During the proceedings against Boettcher, Martina Levato is not allowed to testify again in court. Instead, she submits a written memorial, 6 handwritten pages in which she claims to finally tell the truth. In this document, Martina changes her narrative. She writes that she covered for Alexander out of fear for herself and for her family. She describes a relationship defined by manipulation, coercion, and violence. She speaks of physical punishments, psychological control, endless interrogations, and humiliation framed as love. She describes being forced to call Alexander father or daddy. She recounts being pushed to undergo acts of degradation as proof of devotion. She claims that Alexander was the true architect of the attacks, that he designed every step, that even the plan for the attack on Pietro Barbini included the idea that she alone would take the blame and go to prison. She writes that only detention allowed her to feel safe enough to regain a sense of self. This memorial is deeply unsettling. Not because it absolves Martina Levato, but because it complicates the story. The courts do not accept it as a reason to erase responsibility. Judges reaffirm that despite the dynamics of domination and coercion, Martina acted knowingly and actively. She named the targets, she participated in the attacks, she did not act in ignorance, and yet the memorial cannot be dismissed either. Because it forces us to confront a disturbing reality, that coercion and agency can coexist. The manipulation does not automatically cancel responsibility, and that violence inside a relationship can be both imposed and embraced. This is where the case of the acid couple becomes something more than a series of horrific assaults. It becomes a story about shared madness. What we are looking at is not a lone perpetrator dragging passive victims into crime. It is a relational phenomenon often described as folie à deux, a form of shared delusion where two individuals reinforce each other's distorted beliefs until those beliefs become reality. Inside this kind of dynamic, boundaries dissolve, moral limits shift, cruelty becomes normalized. What is most frightening about folie à deux is that it doesn't require chaos. It doesn't require insanity in the clinical sense. It requires intimacy without correction, a closed emotional system where doubt, disappear, and escalation feels logical. In the case of Alexander Boettcher and Martina Levato, violence becomes the language through which the relationship sustains itself. The attacks are not interruptions of the bond. They are confirmations of it. And this is why the story lingers, because it reminds us that the most dangerous forms of violence are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they grow quietly inside relationship, protected by privacy, by loyalty, by the illusion of love. This episode ends here, but the question it raises does not. Because the idea of madness shared, of violence built and sustained by two people together, is not unique to this case. In the next episode of The Dark Side of Italy, we will explore the phenomenon more deeply through another story, one that shows, once again, how intimacy can become a closed world where cruelty feels justified, and where two minds, instead of stopping each other, accelerate toward destruction. See you next time.